Дорогие друзья, а теперь у нас будет интервью с Тедом Ньюардом. Кто такой Тед Ньюард? Ну, Тед Ньюард, конечно, абсолютно легендарная личность, разорвавшая всем абсолютно мозг на Джокере. Кажется, это был 15-й или 14-й год с докладом Iconoclasm, который стал легендарным. Его знаменитая схема, значит, трехзвенная архитектура и все вот это. Мы Теда знаем, любим, уважаем, и для нас большая честь, что он сегодня в эфире. Профессионал с 20-летним опытом, куча выступлений на конференции, куча книжек, суперзвезда в Штатах, живет со своей женой, 2 сыновьями, 3 котами, 12 лэптопами, 7 планшетами, 9 телефонами и платит до хрена денег за электричество. Дальше интервьюировать с Теда у нас сегодня будут наши любимые Антон Архипов и Барух Садогурский. Я сейчас потихонечку переключусь на английский язык. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce Антон Архипов, Барух Садогурский, and special guest, legendary Mr. Ted Neward. Hello, gentlemen. Hello, gentlemen. How are you doing?
Hello.
Doing well. How are you?
Good. Okay. Welcome to the J-Point broadcast. First and gentlemen, broadcast is yours.
Thank you, Alexei. So first of all, let me just mention that for Ted and for myself, it's past midnight. It's 1:45 a.m. And as
Well,
happy as Ted
to that point, Baruch, I came prepared.
Well, you did well. I mean, you are happy. I'm super miserable because I was supposed to be in bed for 2 hours. So I'm drinking coffee and trying to stay alive.
We do what we must. We do what we must.
The only one in normal time is Anton. I think it's kind of a normal morning for him. And great. And with that, let's get started. Let's get to it. We have only 75 minutes. For Ted, it's kind of saying his opening statements, more or less. If I will even let him do that, as we just went back and forth with I can do the disclaimer myself. A little bit of background to understand how we get into what we're going to discuss. So Ted, you have like 20 years of experience in IT. Most of them you did consulting, obviously ThoughtWorks, like the top of the cream de la cream of IT consulting, and then having your own company. You also worked in DevRel in developer relations for a couple of years, and now you're working for a financial company, almost a bank, the most boring gig that one can think, the most like low tech that one can think. I mean, if you migrated from main to WebSphere, that will be a step forward, and we're going to talk about that. Yeah, let's get started. What are you doing? You were on the peak of IT career, and you are in a bank. Come on, what's going on?
Well, yeah, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is when I first started my career, I did a lot of coding. And back in those days, it was C++ and Windows. Later got into Java, a lot of back-end systems, a lot of web apps, but basically a lot of, I'm sitting there pounding on the keyboard 7 hours a day coding. And then I got into more architectural level gigs. And about that same time, I started doing some corporate instruction. I started teaching for a company here in the States called Developmentor. Developmentor was much more well known in the .NET space than they were really in the Java space. But that's when I really started to do the independent company of one thought leader, blah, 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 sort of thing. And very honestly, kind of reached a pinnacle there and realized that if I was going to really take the next step in my career, I needed to have some management experience. And on top of that, it would be good to understand kind of how the business world works. And one of the best ways I thought to do that was to get more involved in the startup scene. So I did a couple of startups here in Seattle. I did one that lasted for all of about 2 months. And then I got into a 2-year run with a consulting company. Myself and two other guys started. One was kind of our sales guy, one was kind of our ops guy, I was kind of our tech guy. And we built a company of about 20, 25 people after 2 years before, surprise, surprise, the founders decided they couldn't get along, which is pretty much the bane of existence for just about every startup that's ever existed. And then from there, I jumped over to another startup that was further along its arc, which was Smartsheet. And while I was there, I specifically spun up a developer relations team. And did that for about 2 years, and then decided after Smartsheet went public that, there was a change in circumstances there, change of some leadership, and it was like, I don't really want to train a new boss. What I really want to do is I want to get involved in something that will really move the needle for a particular company. Because you notice there's another progression here of small startup, larger funded startup, and in many respects, Quicken Loans, my current employer, is kind of at the far end of that arc, and they're not really a bank. In many respects, we sell mortgage. We don't actually have a vault filled with money. Although certainly Dan Gilbert, one of the richest men in America, owns the Cleveland Cavaliers. You might think we do, but we really don't. And this is a company that has actually they've actually made a living in many respects from attacking the notion of mortgage as stodgy and so forth, and really tried to reinvent. They've tried to disrupt before disrupt was a cool thing, the mortgage space. And Quicken Loans is often confused with Quicken, the personal finance software system. And so a lot of our branding these days is Rocket Mortgage, which if you're in the US, we're actually sponsoring a large golf tournament in Detroit I think it's next week or the week after. We do some very sort of off the wall commercials, but most importantly, Dan Gilbert about 15 years ago decided very deliberately to move the company into downtown Detroit, which has not been a city that's had a really great reputation as being a tech mecca. And he made a very explicit commitment to the city that he would reinvigorate. He would really pour a ton of time and energy and resources into the city to try to bring it back. And he has. That's really what the company has done for 15 years. So this isn't really one of those battleship gray, corporate, boring, we just are interested in the bottom line kind of companies. It's actually a very, very strong culture. And that, in many respects, answers a lot of your question, because what I've really been doing over the last 5-7 years is I've been looking to create a culture, a strong technical culture within a company. Once as the CTO of a consulting company, once as somebody who wanted to create kind of a community both inside and outside the company. In that case, that was Smartsheet. And now seeking to do something similar for the folks over at Quicken Loans. So it's really, to a large degree, my drive towards management has really been mirrored by this drive towards creating a strong, vibrant, healthy technology culture. And so when my boss, who is now the CEO of Quicken Loans, when he said, look, you're really excited by all these things, and we could have you do all this architecture stuff and technology stuff, but I've got a bunch of people who can do that stuff. What I don't really have is somebody who can do what you do, be very, very strongly technical, but also be very ready to sit down and partner with like the HR folks and the recruiting folks. And, there are people who could do it. I don't know that there's anybody here that would do it as well as you. What do you say? And I'm like, okay, challenge accepted. Let's go do this. And that's been my life for the last 4 months now, and hopefully will be for many years to come.
We're going to talk about the culture in a second. What I wanted to mention is that obviously most of our listeners are not familiar with maybe the current state of affairs. So I just wanted to mention that Detroit of today is nothing like the Detroit you remember from the horror news back in probably like 20, 15 years ago when it
Yeah.
really was defaulted and defunded and was in a very bad shape. Now it's much better. It's a great, very nice city. I recommend everybody who visit the United States visit Detroit as well. It's really really nice. So
Well,
yeah, I hear you. It's
to
not.
that
Yeah.
point, that is a large part. I mean, very bluntly, if you come and do what we call our new employee tour, we have a mock-up of the city inside of one of our, nicer public spaces, and they've literally colored each of the buildings that the family of companies, the various companies that Dan Gilbert owns, and it's like half the city. Right. I mean, in some respects, it's kind of like the old RoboCop movie, right? We are OCP. We own the, like the city. But at the same time, you can walk through downtown and not feel threatened. You can, there are a lot of really vibrant restaurants and a really thriving arts culture, and it really is not the urban dystopia that it was, 20 years ago. It's made some remarkable strides, and all credit goes to Dan Gilbert and that commitment he made 15 years ago.
Absolutely. So this is very impressive, and this speaks volumes about how this is not the typical bank that cares about the bottom line and might do some PR stunts to make it look better, but in the end of the day, don't really care about anything but the board of directors and the shareholders. And I understand why a company that has such a reputation and did what it does actually is interested in this kind of position. And let me just mention, your position currently is a director of culture, of technology culture. I am not
Yep.
familiar with such a position in any other place, although probably there are. I'm just never encountered. You are the first director of technology culture that I know. And you know what? I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that you are the person that has this very unusual title. Let's talk about that. You direct culture. How direct the culture?
So, one of the things that I think many companies have come to realize is that culture, in many respects, is vastly more important than any strategy or any initiative or any project or platform that you might build, because culture is baked into the DNA of the company. It describes how the company will respond when crisis hits. And we've seen, in the last 6 months, particularly with the pandemic that has struck, we've seen a lot of companies really just sort of collapse and fold because, there really wasn't much of a strong culture there besides I go to work, I collect my paycheck, I go home. And Dan Gilbert, the owner of QL, founder, chairman, I forget what his exact title is, but one of the things he had done from the very beginning is he had a series of these sort of pithy sayings that he would use on a regular basis. And these later became known as our isms, ISMS. And it's not an acronym, it's just basically, they're syllogisms, colloquialisms, isms. And they're phrases that we frequently quote at one another as a way to sort of get past some of the traditional obstacles that would block your average corporate environment. I'll give you an example. Frequently, when architects get together to sit down and discuss about how to build a software architecture, we spend a great deal of time focusing on the edge cases, the less than 5% cases that will emerge. And if we don't have every single one of those figured out, the whole project is at a standstill, right? We can't move forward until we have actually figured this stuff out. And one of the isms at QL is we'll figure it out. We are a group of smart people and we have faith in our own abilities. We'll figure it out. We'll get to a point where we have to. But in the meantime, let's not hold up what we're trying to accomplish, waiting for that moment when everything is figured out, because very honestly, you'll never have everything figured out. And so it's much better to assume that you're going to have to figure things out down the road than to try to expect that you will have everything planned. I mean, this is in many respects the difference between agile and waterfall, right? We either approach this and solve the problems as they come, or we try to solve everything up front with big upfront design. And part of this is also a culture of, one of the isms is yes before no. Most corporations, they actually, the default answer is no. Hey, I want to go do this remote conference in Russia. Are you guys okay with that? No. And we don't know why, but no, because it'll come to us later. No. QL, on the other hand, says yes before no. In other words, yeah, let's go do that. And then as we go, if we figure out maybe this isn't a great idea and here are some reasons why, okay, cool, then we can back away from it if we need to. But we'd rather fail trying than fail sitting around and doing nothing. That kind of a culture doesn't just happen. And one of the things that QL has been very, very good about is building that culture amongst its bankers. I mean, let's be very clear. Mortgage, there's no secret sauce to mortgage. There's no secret product. There's no secret algorithm. It's not like we have a better, we are the biggest mortgage lender in the United States. We own about 8% of the market, which by far puts us ahead of everybody else. 8% ahead of everybody else. That tells you how fragmented that market is. But the secret sauce, the main thing that we offer, very frankly, is extraordinarily good customer service. It's by far one of the smoothest experiences an American will ever have, because we are, unfortunately, America only. I think we do some mortgage in Canada, but for the most part, we're entirely an American company selling to American consumers. And it's just super smooth. We'll go up onto our website, click through a couple of questions. There may be some additional stuff that you have to get on a phone and talk to a banker, get some additional documents. But in some cases, we turn around a mortgage application in like 10 days, where the industry standard is 35. And part of the reason we do that is because, again, one of the isms is dog fooding. We eat our own dog food. So if I'm planning to get a mortgage or if I'm planning to get a refi, I will, I will actually do it through my own company using our own software systems. Another is that all of our bankers are required to turn, phone calls around in 24 hours. It's those sorts of things. And we've been very, very good historically about making sure that the culture affects the bankers. But now, in many respects, we need to start taking a very active look as to how we grow and enhance that culture for the technologists. And the technology folks are very enthusiastic, but in many cases, they're misunderstood by a lot of the rest of the company. And so in many respects, my job is to advocate for the developers inside of QL, as well as to serve as a bridge to the development world outside of QL. That's part of the reason why I have a developer relations team that reports to me. I don't run the team. Another gentleman, Chris Woodruff, he actually runs that team. But, we are thinking about all these things that generally intersect with the rest of the company, and how do we make this experience sublime for the developers as a whole? How do we create a mentoring program? How do we ensure that we have talent development capabilities inside the company, bringing in external speakers to lecture to our developers? I mean, somebody's got to shepherd and own all of those programs.
So I quote the examples that you provide, and that will be like, we'll figure it out. Done is better than perfect, and yes before no, the ongoing culture, and the dog fooding, obviously a fanatic support. it sounds very familiar. We are our company is in the Silicon Valley, and this is something that we do every day. This is what the best Silicon Valley startup values are. So I understand where it comes from, and when you say the culture doesn't just happens, well, it happens, but it happens on a different scale. It happens with 3 founders and far more people. It happens in a crazy fast and new and fresh and disrupting startup scene. So it makes sense that it actually needs to be implanted and then pushed forward in a much larger organization, much more mature organization, and again, organization in the market, which is much less fast pacing and much more low tech, if you wish. So my
I
question
think.
would
Well,
be,
hold on, because
what is,
there's
yeah,
really, if you think about it, right? Culture is defined by the people at the top. When you're in a small startup, it's really easy to see what's important to the people at the top because you're literally interacting with them on a day-to-day basis. But when you're a company of, say, 30,000 people, how do you as a founder or you as a co-founder, how do you as the person at the top, how do you demonstrate that these are the things that are important to you? You throw money and resources and people at it, right? And those are the things that matter to you. And so in many respects, you can almost look at the fact that I'm doing this as the Z team is what we call our C-suite. The Z team has decided this is what's important to our to our technology group, and therefore, yes, we will hire somebody, and we will not hire somebody cheap. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and we will build a team underneath them, and we will have them challenge us as executives periodically to say, yeah, these are things we should do. And that's exactly what I mean. Once you get beyond the small incubator and that first inflection point of 30 some odd people, the way you express your culture is not with motivational posters on the wall, but with actual people doing actual things and making things happen within the company.
exactly, yes. And let's talk about things that you actually do, and how do you take this vision from the management and actually drive it to the entire organization, and at least the technology organization, because uh, I don't think other your competitors or other larger organizations don't want a better culture. It's just not necessarily easy or clear or even understandable how to do it. How do you take the culture and the vision of the management and infuse the entire organization with it?
So, in many respects, I think it begins with management's acceptance that they don't know everything. Um, that may actually come across as like Ted's trying to be funny or witty, but in many respects, it's important because if you have a management structure, if you have a management culture that says we understand that there are things going on within the world that we don't understand, right? If they're really willing to sort of channel their inner Socrates who said, I only know that I know nothing, then you begin by asking questions. And you start by asking questions like, how do we know that our developers are happy? I mean, you can literally just start with that question. How do we know our developers are happy? And if they're not happy, what would make them happy? Or do our developers even know what would make them happy? Or how do we start soliciting this opinion in such a way that we are genuinely listening? Because to a lot of companies, I think the management wants to they want to pay lip service, to be really honest. They want to say, we do all these surveys, we're constantly looking to make sure that our developers are scoring us 5 out of 5 or at least a 4.5 out of 5 on these, all these various numerical scales. But we never read the comments. We never actually look at the free-form text fields where people can tell us what they're thinking. What we want to know is that, are we getting at least a 4.5 out of 5? And if we're not, then we do one of two things. We either A, throw some money at the problem until, we'll get some ping pong tables, we'll get some kegs, we'll get free massages, we'll get free lunches, we'll go after all of these perks to try to make the developers happy. Or we will say, you know what? Developers, who understands them? They're replaceable anyway. If they don't like it here, we can just hire new ones. As a matter of fact, we could fail more cheaply if we hire a bunch of folks offshore somewhere. Let's just do that. And it really begins with a genuine desire to connect with people at a people level. And frankly, a lot of management just doesn't want to do that. Assuming you have management that genuinely wants to invest in their people, because that's really what we're talking about, is we're talking about an investment. We're talking about it in some cases a financial investment, but more than anything, it's an emotional investment. It's time, it's energy, it's a willingness to listen and be vulnerable to what people will tell you. Because it can be very hard to have people come up and say, yeah, you're a nice guy, Ted, but working on your team, I feel basically lost. I feel like I just have no idea what's going on. I feel like, you're a dictator. You don't really pay attention to what I say. I mean, that hurts, but you need to hear it. And, there may be reasons why you've done the things that you've done, but you still have to be open to hearing that. You still have to be open to listening to that and acknowledging that, yeah, okay, I can understand how you feel that way. Maybe it doesn't change my decisions. Maybe it does. And in that sense, you're now already beginning the path towards thinking about how you improve your culture. Because then you start saying, all right, what are the pain points of the developers inside my company? What are they lacking? What are they missing? And then you can really start to dive into some of the sort of pragmatic, concrete initiatives, like we don't feel like our developers are really keeping up with all of the things that are happening in the technology world. So therefore, let's bring some of those folks in virtually now, thanks to the pandemic. But let's bring those folks in. Let's bring those industry thought leaders who are talking on subjects that we care about. Let's bring them into our space and let's have them talk to our developers. And we're not going to get these people for free, so let's throw some money at this problem and get, literally some of the industry giants within whatever particular industry we care to name. Or we really feel like our developers don't have a clear progression, a clear career progression. How do I measure myself? How do I know that I am a senior as opposed to, Jimmy over there, who is supposedly a senior, but I seem to know more than he does, or Sarah over there, who actually seems to know more than me, but she's still flagged as a junior developer. How are we measuring these things? How do I know where I rank in all of these different places? That's going to require a great deal of soul searching and a great deal of time and energy and effort. And that's where management says, you know what? I don't know that I can answer those questions, but we should conduct a search, or we should start looking around inside the company to find somebody and put them into a position where they can at least formulate these questions so that we can then get to some answers, that we can start to make some real progress. And in many respects, you can certainly try to change the culture in a bottom-up fashion. And frankly, that's what a lot of companies would rather you do, because then managers can be just very hands-off and say, hey, great, you guys do your thing. We'll be management up here, and you laborers down here, you do your thing. And if you want to, I don't know, play video games or organize a weekly Halo night or whatever, you guys do your thing. You go be geeks, and we'll be management. And as soon as you as soon as you identify that gulf, as soon as you identify that differential, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of success changing the culture, except on a very, very limited basis. So it really, really begins with executive buy-in, and it begins with the executives saying, we're not quite sure what to do. We're not quite sure how to relate, how to engage. We need to start asking these questions. And on that philosophical basis, you can start to make some real change. Is really what it boils down to. It's change management.
This is really exciting, and when I hear what you are saying, I'm actually thinking about the book that I read lately. It's War, Peace, and IT, and obviously for our Russian-speaking audience, the War and Peace resonates, and it has some correlations to War and Peace, and it is about the struggle between the management in traditional or if you wish low tech or not technical company and the IT department in those companies. And I think the QL matches this description of being not 100% IT company. And the entire book is about the struggle. It's about how management sees those geeks as strange at least and dangerous at most, because they do play with their things and then we don't understand what they are doing. We have no control. This is very dangerous and very scary. And also on top of that, it's also a relationship of a contractor. Even with internal IT department, we and it comes from both sides. The IT department demands to know everything in advance and know all the possible features, and then tag a price in terms of how long it will take, and then they debate. Obviously, before a 2 years, 5 years transformation project, those numbers completely out of nowhere, and they debate about this, and they come with magic number. Then the struggle continues. All this, well, this is not what we want something else. Yes, but you already asked for this thing, and if you want more, we want more money. And all these dynamics that happen, most of the companies are all rooted in a flawed in the float culture. And some of the things that you said remind me of this book, because you actually mentioned how even your management, which is very, I would say, pro this culture, still sees the geeks as weird at least and dangerous at most. How do you work this culture not only downstream to the IT organization, but also upstream to the management?
So, in many respects, it helps to have a boss. Although within QL we refer to management as leaders, so it helps to have a leader who understands technology. He actually comes from a technology background. He's been in fintech for 20 some odd years before he got to QL. So he slung some code. He probably hasn't done it in 5 or 10 years, but neither have I. So that's fair. And in many respects, he is my voice, right? He is, if I need to go have some sort of discussion or argument or something, if you will, amongst the executives, I can go to Brian and say, hey, Brian, I need this. And he will tell me, okay, I will go to bat for you. Or he'll tell me why it's not good to go to bat for that particular thing, or why now might not be the best time, when here's how we can go about and accomplish the same thing in a different manner. Or again, there's kind of this yes before no, let's go do that, unless there's extremely glaring reasons not to. But ultimately, Baruch, what it really boils down to, and I think this is going to be true for companies across the planet, whether the relationship is one that's contractual or whether it's internal, it really comes down to trust. I mean, this is what I mean about an emotional investment. Within up here in the Seattle area, there is a startup called Gravity Payments, and they do, as near as I can tell, they're basically like a Stripe or a similar sort of payment processor for small to medium businesses. And when the pandemic hit, of course, half their clientele close their doors, because if you're doing small to medium businesses, particularly mom and pop shops, nobody was going to get coffees, nobody was going to these independent bookstores, nobody was going to these small coffee shops and independent auto mechanics and comic book stores and all that stuff. So half their clientele disappeared overnight. And the fascinating thing about this story is, first of all, the CEO immediately stopped taking his salary. This is the same guy, by the way, who a number of years ago instituted a minimum salary for all of his employees. Everybody at the company makes at least $70,000. If you are employed for this company, you're guaranteed at least that amount of money. And at the time, he was absolutely crucified by so many voices in the sort of business press. Forbes and a couple of these other publications were like, "Oh my gosh, this is stupid. Your company's going to go bankrupt, etc." The interesting thing is, when the pandemic hit and they lost half their clientele, which meant half their income disappeared overnight, if not 3/4 to all of it. I don't know their numbers, but the employees, mind you, without talking to the CEO, the employees all decided that they would voluntarily take a 50% pay cut just so that the company would stay in business. That didn't happen at United Airlines or Continental or any of these other big companies, because those big companies have not spent the time emotionally investing in their employees, and there's no sense of trust. I don't, if I work for United Airlines, I don't trust that the CEO there has my interests at heart. I believe that CEO is trying to maximize his payout and score his bonus, which frequently he does by laying off people. We see that pattern over and over and over again in business. Company X lays off 5 to 10% of their workforce. The stock price surges, which is what triggers the CEO's bonus. CEO takes their multi-million-dollar bonus and then before too long exits the company to go work for this other company because somebody from that company sits on this board. So now I go work and sit on that board. I mean, there's a lot of old boy network, if you will, at that level. They're not really thinking about what's really good for the employees at that company. That is a thing that you see more often in a small company because, it's easier to trust you, the employee, because I sit next to you. If I'm the founder and you're the employee, I sit right next to you. And, that's harder to do with a company of 30,000 unless you have a significant percentage of people who have been there from the beginning. And sure enough, Quicken Loans, we just celebrated our 35th anniversary last week, and we have employees at the company, a sizable number of employees at the company who have been there for 25 plus years, people who did sit next to Dan Gilbert back in the day. And they have watched year after year after year. They've watched the founder, the chairman, the guy who's richer than most of us could ever even dream to be, continually do the right thing, which is one of our isms, on behalf of our employees. It really boils down to a question of trust. Do I trust the person sitting across the table from me is genuinely acting in the best interests of the company? And if so, then I have to acknowledge that what they want might actually be a reasonable thing. And if it's reasonable, then let me think not about how do I protect myself against the possibility that we might miss a deadline. How do I actually sit down and try to find a way to work with them in order to get to a win-win situation, as opposed to constantly being in a CYA cover your ass scenario? It's really about trust. Do you trust your management? And if the answer is no, the company's culture is not particularly strong. If the answer is yes, but I don't trust their manager or the manager after that, you're in probably this wavering point. And if the answer is, yep, I trust my management all the way up through the CEO, then you're at a good place to work. I don't care what the domain is. I don't care whether it's technology or otherwise. Do you trust your management? And flip side, does management trust the employees? If I go to my CEO and say, I think we have a problem, is he going to say, all right, tell me what you think the problem is. Let's have this conversation, because I trust that you're seeing things that I don't. Or is the CEO going to go, I've got meetings. I've got a very important business meeting in the Bahamas that I need to jump on the corporate jet and fly down for, and just whatever it is, you handle it. That's really, to me, the key differential, is that question of trust. And managers earn that trust by acting in the best interests of their employees repeatedly over time. And that builds trust, amongst the employees, who then have opportunities to demonstrate that to the managers. It's all about trust, man.
Yep, that makes tons of sense. And speaking about the book and Mark Schwartz, he spoke a lot about that, and this is obviously one of the most important answers. And I think that the technological background of the leadership matters a lot as well. If they don't see the developers as geeks or freaks, then obviously you are in a much better state. So.
Well, I was just going to say,
Yeah.
if Dan Gilbert or Mike Malloy or Bob Walters or any of the president, the chairman, et cetera, if they were sitting in my office right now, I think they would look around at my bookshelves. They would look around at these mounds of paper I've got everywhere. They would look at all these things that I do and say, don't have a clue what you do. Don't have a clue how you can be so enamored of all these devices. I don't get it. At the same time, I don't get mortgage, man. I don't understand the fascination with interest rates and points and the secondary market and capital finance markets and how we can resell mortgages to other people. And I don't get any of that. But if one of those guys comes to me and says, hey, we need something in order to help us better, capture a particular segment of the lending market, I have implicit trust that they know what they're talking about. I don't have to understand it, but I definitely trust that they know what they're doing. And so now it's important for me to act on it and make it happen. And that's really the key differential. There are a bunch of people who look at me and go, dude, you are such a geek. And that's cool. And I look at them and I'm like, you're such a banker. I mean, seriously, you remind me of Wolf of Wall Street, just all up and down. And you know what? I don't have to like you. I don't have to, truthfully, I've yet to find somebody at Quicken Loans that I haven't liked, but I don't have to like this individual. Do I trust that they know what they're doing? Do I trust that they know what they're talking about? If the answer is yes, great. Now, how do I help them be successful? And that in turn makes us all successful. Win.
Yep. That makes sense, and this is interesting. But I wanted to get, we have like half an hour left to go. I wanted to get to a little bit of details to whatever you can share with us. How do you do that? How your organization looks like? How is your day-to-day looks like? You mentioned that you have a team of developer relations, and I can understand that their job is at part of it, at least, is building a very strong technical brand for QL and explaining to the developers out there that it's actually fun, that you're doing cool things, that it's not all mainframes and web spheres. What else?
So part of historically, when you think of developer relations, you think of company like JFrog or Sun/Oracle or Microsoft, whose products are sold to developers. And in those scenarios, developer relations is really sort of an extension of your sales and marketing arm. With a company that doesn't sell to developers, aka Quicken Loans, Smartsheet, which is a low-code/no-code tool. When you think about companies like Netflix, let's be blunt, Netflix doesn't sell to developers. They in some respects have no business being as highly technical as they really are. To even a certain degree, Amazon in the early days when they were building AWS, they weren't really selling to developers. They were creating what they needed internally in order to expand the company. DevRel takes on a different air to it. It takes on a different flavor. And in many respects, developer relations, the idea of relating to developers is as much an internal play as much as it is an external play. We think about developer relations as reaching out to the developers external to the company at things like conferences and blogs and webinars and so forth, and how our company relates to those external developers. But also, how do we relate to the developers inside the company? So part of my sphere of influence, if you will, is training. How do I make sure that our developers are the smartest in the world? Well, part of that means we've got to make sure that they are up to speed on all of the latest things that are happening. Now, we happen to be a .NET shop significantly inside the company. We also happen to use Progress, which is an old 4GL type platform. We also do some, we do a lot of JavaScript, as you might well imagine. We even have a smattering of Elixir, and I believe we've got at least one or two teams that are actually doing some full-blown Java, particularly in our data science space. How do I keep all these people up to snuff? How do I keep them caught up, right? And so part of that is, this is literally where you get to the notion of execution. One of the isms is that innovation is celebrated, but execution is worshipped. It's great to have a good idea. Oh, I think we should do blank. But now, how do you execute on that idea, right? So one of the very first things I did when we got technology culture spun up and I started, working with Woody to build out the DevRel team, I said, I want you to go out and find a bunch of people that we both know, but I want you to bring them in and I want you to have them start teaching workshops to us. Now, Woody, you're going to have to go and figure out how we're going to record these, how we're going to, connect them up, how you're working out all of the AV stuff. Those are going to be the details that I need you to figure out. And he did quite an amazing job of it. As a matter of fact, Venkat Subramaniam was the first one we brought in. And you can ask Venkat, man, it was a first run and it was flawless. It was absolutely flawless. They just knocked it out of the park. And we had literally, I think, a third of our entire technology team, 2,000 strong, were all tuned in for 4 hours on a Tuesday, listening to Venkat basically do his spiel around JavaScript and talking about some of the interesting things you can do with modern JavaScript, decorators and whatnot. And then if I remember right, he got in a little bit into TypeScript. That doesn't just happen. That's not just me picking up the phone and saying, hey, Venkat, old buddy, you want to come and do a thing? And Venkat goes, okay. And then he just shows up. There's execution that needs to be a part of that.
That's exactly how it works. So maybe you need another example, but...
No, there was still a lot of things that really needed to be worked out because Venkat, don't get me wrong, right? Venkat's an amazing presenter. He could handle his end smoothly, but we needed to work out, for example, an outline. What was he actually going to talk about? What would have the greatest impact to our developers as opposed to, not necessarily what's going to be the sexiest talk possible to bring people in the door, but what's going to actually make a difference to our developers. And then we had to figure out, how are we going to record this? How are we going to slice and dice the recording up into segments so that people could tune in for the parts that they wanted or needed? Because not everybody is going to be able to consume all of what Venkat was saying. We deliberately tried to do kind of a, I won't call it an intro, but sort of I'm new to ECMAScript 2015 classes and so forth. I understand 2015, but I don't understand decorators and prototypes and some of the more meta programmatic techniques. And then lastly, great, now I want to see some additional type safety on top of my JavaScript. There's very few people who will actually be able to consume all three of those and be equally entertained and educated from start to finish. So breaking this up into 3 sections, working out what that outline was, figuring out how we want the length of each of those, figuring out how we're going to record those, doing basically what you guys are doing in many respects, and figuring out the logistics, being able to take questions, although apparently we've had no questions yet, or else I haven't stopped talking long enough for us to take questions, either one. But all of that is execution, right? It's not just enough to be the idea guy. You also then have to figure out what are the obstacles that are preventing this thing from happening, and how do I move those obstacles out of my way? I mean, one of the most fundamental things was Woody had to go figure out how to pay the man. How do we generate an invoice and run it through our system? And how much budget do we have? And that, again, this stuff just doesn't happen. Venkat can handle his end, and he did a marvelous job of doing it. How do we get to the point where Venkat can hold up his end? That's
Absolutely.
execution. That is the thing that I think a lot of developers don't really understand, that it takes just as much time and energy to execute on a program like this as it does to write code and so forth. The worst part of it is most of the execution is non-deterministic, so it's very hard to unit test. So, just because you got it worked out once doesn't mean it'll work flawlessly the second time. By about the third or fourth, if you haven't run across any major obstacles, you could probably assume you've got it down to a smooth running process. But the first time, oh, good Lord, anything could happen. You have no idea what obstacles will rear their ugly head at you, and you have to be prepared to just kind of deal with them as they come. That's really create a strategy and then execute on it.
That makes sense. And you know what? The funny thing is that in this point of how the developer relations differ from developer relations in JFrog or other companies that sell products to developers, or at least make products to developers, is actually you're preaching to the crowd, because especially in Russia and ex-USSR countries, there are not a lot product companies in general, but every company here, including banks, financial organizations, enterprises, every organization have a very healthy developer relations team that do exactly that. So in this in this regard, when I came with my, Silicon Valley standard of developer relations, let me tell you how you can solve problems with my products, they were like, well, there are other goals of DevRel. There are other things that developer relations care about. And that was a very interesting aspect for me. So, and now you're preaching to the crowd. Those people know exactly what they're talking about. So this is fascinating.
Yeah.
Anton, do we have any interesting questions?
In the chat so far, no, but maybe we can switch to the topic of developer relations.
We just went for 20 minutes about developer relations. Let's do more.
Oh, let's do more. No, I mean the external developer relations. How do you know?
Why are you doing exactly? So we understood that how you empower your developers, right? That makes sense. But developer relations is two-way street, right? So you have something that you bring in, and this is, in some cases, feedback about the product on how to make it better. The other is just helping the developers make better. There is the outside direction as well.
Well, and for one of the things I think that we in the technology space have come to acknowledge is that this notion of building a platform is really critical, right? That regardless of who you are, you will undoubtedly want to expose an API to somebody. And in many respects, you may not expose that API externally. You may only expose it internally, but you may make a business decision later to expose it externally. And again, if you hold this ism of eat your own dog food really up to the light, that means that you should treat your internal APIs the same way you would treat your external APIs. So if we would have an API platform that demands documentation and examples and somebody to make sure that we are tracking bugs against the API, from an external perspective rather than from an internal perspective, I mean, somebody's got to do a lot of that work. And, in many organizations, a developer relations group is the focal point for a lot of that. That may be where your technical writers are. That may be where your first tier support teams are, et cetera, right? If you're a Twilio and you're an API company, I mean, that really is all of you. I mean, everything you do is essentially external facing. But even if you're a bank, and even if you never, ever, ever offer anything to an external partnership, you still really want to think about, here's my service team, and I'm building a service that exposes an API. I really want the other developers within the company who are consuming my service. I want to know that they have good documentation. I want to know that they have someplace they can go to for their questions. I want to know that they can file bugs against my API. What I want literally is for us to think about my API as if it were an external API. The other thing, and this to me is a lesser issue than what I just talked about, but very frankly, there is a certain amount of recruiting effort that goes in with any sort of corporate DevRel program. So, by hiring people to go out and speak at conferences, even if they never said word one about anything that we are making available to anybody, going out and speaking at conferences just sends the signal to people that this is a company that understands, number one, the importance of giving back to the community. Number two, the importance of technical topics and the ability to articulate those topics. And number three, they're talking about some cool shit. And let's be really honest. When you find yourself thinking about where you want to go next, do you want to go to a boring IT company, or do you want to go to a company where cool kids are doing cool shit? The only way you're going to know about it is if somebody comes to a conference or goes to a blog or spins up an online training class, Pluralsight, LinkedIn, Parlays, whatever, and talks about stuff. That's going to be an important way for the company to be able to let you know that they're doing something beyond just mainframes and WebSphere. By the way, there is not one instance of WebSphere running anywhere inside of Quicken Loans. I checked before I actually got employed there. So enough with your WebSphere jokes. The DevRel department isn't always about selling tools to developers or selling you on their open source framework or any of that kinds of stuff. And open source is its own whole interesting other pillar, right? If you've got a company that does contribute on a regular basis to open source, your DevRel team, in many cases, will be heavily involved in the open source projects, and then that way serve as a gateway from the company to the external world and vice versa. So there's a lot of different angles to a developer relations team, but fundamentally, we are approaching a point where any company on the planet is rapidly being faced with a choice. They can either be a company that considers IT as a cost center and something to be minimized because this is just what we have to do to keep the lights on, or they can see IT as a competitive advantage and it's something to invest in. And the ones that have a developer relations team, I would be willing to bet a substantial amount of money on, as a matter of fact. The ones that see IT as a competitive advantage are the ones that have developer relations teams. Everybody who doesn't probably belongs in that first category, and they see it as a cost center, and eventually they will start losing their lunch to the people who see it as a competitive advantage.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. That makes tons of sense. And obviously IT is competitive advantage. And I point you back to Mark Schwartz's great book. It's like, it's amazing how on point the book, how aligned this book and our discussion is. And that's just fascinating. So, okay. So we nailed down the development.
A lot of these issues, I was just going to say, a lot of these issues are not new. A lot of these issues are very, very much business thinking that has been thought for 100 years that are just cycling around into the IT space. So it doesn't require a whole lot of magical thinking or forward vision to see them. You just have to understand that we're not that different from the people that came before us 50 or 100 years ago.
Yep. Yeah. That's obviously I think we are, at least I hope the audience of JPoint, being the technical people, understand that they are actually an asset and not a burden for a company or a cost center. Okay, yes. So you have the developer relations team, but you are not the manager of developer relations. So there is more to that. What else?
So there are a lot of programs that we want to do both internally and externally that aren't really about developers per se. They relate to technology. So I'll give you another example. We just recently met with a professor with Michigan State University about sponsoring a couple of capstone projects. These are sort of the non-trivial projects that a group of college students will do as part of their graduation requirements to get a computer science degree from Michigan State. So figuring out what sort of program can we what could the kids do that would be relevant to us at Quicken Loans that would still be a project that a group of college students could go and engage in. And in some cases we tell them, hey, let's go try something completely off the wall and let's run an experiment and see where this goes. That's one thing. Figuring out job titles and responsibilities and descriptions, right? Hey, Baruch, what's the difference between a junior developer, a developer, and a senior developer, and how do we measure those, right? How do I objectively tell somebody that they are a junior versus a senior? And by the way, where does architect come into this? Do you have to be a senior developer to be an architect? Does a senior developer become a junior architect, or does a junior developer become a junior architect? What exactly is our career progression path? And do we have a path for people who decide, yep, I want to go into management, I want to learn how to run a team, as opposed to those who say, I want to stay an individual contributor for the rest of my career. I just want to tackle bigger and bigger and more interesting projects, but please don't ever have anybody report to me because that would just be a disaster, right? What's their career path look like? What's their progression? How do we grow them? What do they need to grow in? All of these are things that, you could say, yeah, these are developer relations sorts of things. And that may be true, but we also have agile coaches and we have product owners and we have people who are, very DevOps focused and in some cases more ops focused than not. We have desktop support people. Does the path to becoming a programmer within the company, particularly if you've got no technical background, does it mean you have to become one of our technical support folks before you get a chance to program? Because that's kind of what it was, 20, 25, 30 years ago, right? You kind of had to, earn your way by slogging through the crap like everybody else did before you would be given an opportunity to program. Because somehow doing desktop support taught you about programming. I don't quite know how that was supposed to work, but I mean, these are all things.
You are a programmer. You need to be able to fix computers. This is what people expect from you.
Yeah, no. These are the kinds of things that need to be thought about, need to be sorted out, need to be, somebody needs to own these things. Somebody needs to think about how does a senior engineer that is a progress engineer relate to a senior .NET engineer versus a senior front-end web designer versus, because the HR folks, they're going to give it their best shot. But in many cases, the best thing they're going to be able to do is go and talk to different people on different teams and say, what makes a good developer? And then they'll have like 47 different descriptions of good developers that are specific to each one of those teams. And when we get new people interview at the company, if they don't fit precisely one of those 47 slots, what do we do with them? Are we in fact when we get a candidate into our interview cycle, I mean, let's acknowledge the current environment in which we currently live. How are we certain that we're not accidentally biased against people who are Black or people who are women or people of Black, Indigenous, people of color, etc.? Do we have any metrics tracking any of this stuff? Are we in fact being objective in our evaluation of their technical skills? Have we actually sanity tested those objective assessments, I say with quotation marks, to ensure that they are in fact objective? Have we tried running them against known quantities, as in like our own developers inside? Who owns these things, right? somebody with a technical background has to own many of these things if they are going to be applied, objectively within a technical organization. And, we call that team technology culture, and I lead it. And other groups may have different decisions. And in a company that is purely a technology company, when, say, 90% of your employee workforce is all technologists, you could probably get that by osmosis just by, having people in HR that are surrounded by people who are technology. But Quicken Loans is a company of 30,000, probably 15 to 20,000 of which are bankers. So that's a different world for them to start thinking about technology and how they interact and grow and so forth. They're technology folks. Somebody has to own all that, and that buck stops here.
This is fascinating. Are you hiring? That might be one of the most fascinating areas I heard in a while. And when I think about the next thing, you know what? The challenge is enormous, but it should be extremely satisfying to actually move this beast forward and make sure that you improve the culture. So and it makes tons of sense because both what you spoke about the career trajectory and how you determine who are junior and who are senior and how do you manage transition between different roles in a company which not necessarily understands how developers work as opposite to how bankers work. I see the need and I see how it can be fulfilled with a position such as yours.
Yeah,
Antonio,
it's
what do we?
Well, I could ask the question from the chat, actually. I think it's a good one. So as an individual, if you are not in developer relations, but you see that there are some things that could be improved, what could you suggest to the person if he doesn't know where to start?
Ted, before you start,
the
I have a
improvements.
shameless plug to deliver. As a part of this one ticket for 8 different conferences that we have here in the Jagru group, we're going to have the DevOps conference, which is the DevOps conference, but in real life, DevOps. And we, Leonid Golnik and myself, we're going to deliver a talk about exactly that, about how do you influence a culture if you are not in the position of authority and in the position of maybe individual contributor. So if you have a full pass, don't miss this talk in DevOps next week. Ted, what do you say?
Well, what I would say is, fundamentally, you can do a certain amount of things at an individual level by just undertaking some tasks, by doing some things on your own. If you want to see some of your colleagues improve, begin a book club. Get together with a couple of your colleagues. All of you buy a book that you collectively agree that you'd like to read and study, and then hold each other accountable. Every week, we will read a chapter, right? Venkat has a book on Kotlin, I believe, that's coming out soon. He's got one on TypeScript that's a couple of years old that's very good. And the nice thing about the Prague books is they're pretty short, but they're pretty easy to work through in terms of, I'm going to read this chapter, and then this chapter, and then this chapter. It's very much structured in a sort of hero's journey style. So form a book club. All of you buy the book. All of you go out to lunch, discuss what you read in the chapter, discuss how it applies to what you do at work, and do that for a couple of books. And one of two things will happen. Either A, the company will see it and go, what do you know? They're teaching themselves. Cool. We don't have to spend any money on them. And if that's the case, Alistair Coburn has a great quote. If you cannot change your corporate culture, it may be time to change your corporate culture. Or the other reaction that the company will have is, oh, wow, there's something going on here these things are happening with us not putting any time, effort, resources into it. What would happen if we as a company did throw some time, effort, and resources into it? What if we gave you an hour or two a week for you to do some of these kinds of things? What if we stood up a hackathon within the company and had the, just let people hack on whatever they want? What if we gave people, like I said, an hour or two of focus time every week to go study whatever they were interested in? In some cases, you can get some meaningful results for relatively little investment. But at the end of the day, let's be really clear. You're going to need to get management, at the very least, you're going to need to get management tolerance of the efforts that you're trying to accomplish, if not their outright support for it to have any real lasting effect. And in some ways, the way you do that is by building up some credibility with your management, and then their management, and then their management. I don't know how you do that in the organization you're in, but you want to think about framing it in terms that they can understand. If you let me start this program, I think we can reduce separations. In other words, we can reduce the number of people who quit and leave the company, because we are now addressing some of the concerns that I've heard my peers describe. The only way I get ahead at this company is if I go leave the company and then come back. Okay, well, talk to your management, talk to their management and say, how exactly do I get a promotion here? Has anybody ever really sat down and talked about creating a formal program for describing how we get promotions here, or for identifying this? Many cases, your HR folks are very eager to try to create that kind of formalized program so that they can administer it and that they can reward people and they can, describe promotions on a more objective basis, because that also reduces their vulnerability to lawsuits, to be very blunt about it. So it really sort of comes down to, can you position some of the things you want to do in such a way that management sees it as an advantage to them to be able to put some of their weight and authority and investment behind? At the end of the day, if you are just a developer, you can do some things local to your team, and that might catch, your manager's eye and then their manager's eye, and they may approach you and say, what if you start doing these things a little bit more widespread throughout the company? And then you are on the path to ending up perhaps where I am. But that's, I'm not going to suggest that that's a guaranteed recipe for success. It's really going to depend on the environment that you're in, and it's going to depend on whether or not you're going to be able to really sell it to management to invest in. It's going to require some investment at some point.
Absolutely. And for more techniques and elaboration on this technique, don't miss our talk at the booth. Yeah, there you go. Perfect. All right, so we are almost out of time, and let me just mention again that it's like 2 a.m. over here, so I guess we will jump for a while to Zoom to say hi to everybody and maybe take a question or two, but please don't expect us to be there for the entire hour. And thank you very much, Ted, for doing that. I understand that although it's easier from some way, you don't need to fly to Moscow to attention point. It's also kind of weird to jump between conferences. And you know what? It's like doing all the bad stuff in travel, having jet lag, without doing all the good stuff in travel, going places and seeing people. But it is what it is now. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Cast. And okay, good. Okay, thank you very much for this broadcast. Do you hear me correct?
Yes.
Good. Thank you very much. And yes, as you mentioned, all the viewers, all the participants are welcome to Zoom. You can find the link just like under the player. Push the button, go follow the Zoom link, and you will have like 10, maybe 15 minutes with Ted, Anton, and Baruch. Thank you very much, folks. It was very, very good and interesting. And see you a bit later.